Is political violence a legitimate resistance tool? Oh yeah, but is assassination a part of that? No. Let's talk about what resistance history has to say about both. It's going to be a bumpy ride, folks, so just strap in. I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm an American scholar of resistance history at the University of Southern Denmark and Johns Hopkins, and the author of A Resistance History of the United States. When does violence become an option, on the table, and then permitted, and then maybe necessary in American history? Although a kind of violence results when people get angry, of course, when they're desperate, violence as a resistance tool happens when a few other things converge. And understanding them helps us understand what resistance is about and how it actually works. See, most people confuse all protest and opposition with resistance. Now, they're related and they're worth studying, but they're not the same thing. Resistance is much more pointed. It's what happens when people have had enough of an abusive authority, usually a state, always a regime, and want to do something to change it, but something that lasts, something that creates or seeks to create structural, permanent change, the kind that topples an empire, that ends the oppression of millions, that tears up constitutions, whatever it takes to end exploitation and brutality at scale, against usually a government doing anything but acting in the interests of the governed. That's after resistance moments become movements. Most fail, but a few succeed, and we learn a lot from both. When it comes to violence and resistance, there are a few conditions that have to be met. Some preconditions, some precipitants, some triggers. Peaceful paths to oppositions have to reveal themselves as not just ineffective, but illegitimate. They don't work to achieve change because they're structured to keep change from happening. And then there's what we call hidden transcripts. The illegal actions to address the effects of abusive authority can't scale enough to erode the power behind the authority. Think the Underground Railroad, right? The 1850s was a period of major escalation. The First Republic was in overdrive to protect the interests of the enslavers who ran it. The courts, the Congress, the executive, all in service to the enslavers. On the other side, the hidden transcript was the Underground Railroad, getting all of those people out of slavery. But guess which one was building faster? The Underground Railroad was doing a lot to address the symptoms, but it was never going to be enough to cure the disease. And the third condition is that the abusive authority metastasizes, spreads like a cancer. All abusive authority does, it will grow and expand and continue until it is stopped. And as in the 1840s and 1850s, the enslavers' republic was expanding almost exponentially, even using the military as a tool, invading another country, engaging in war as pretty much an effort to protect the interests of the few guys to make more money through oppressing other people. For all the talk about America spreading liberty, the United States was actually in the business of spreading slavery across North America. When those three conditions emerge, resistance movements then have to face the question that changes everything that a lot of people are asking today. What happens next? Because structural change, permanent change, the kind that erases enslaver power from the Constitution forever, you don't get there with a lawsuit or a sign. I wish it was different. People tried, they failed. Our history says it doesn't work that way. Meanwhile, today, right now, there are people who never faced that question or seem to know our history, lecturing everyone from some smug pedestal about violence having no place in our democracy. As if the democracy they're talking about wasn't built and preserved, bought and paid for by people willing to make just those choices. It's practically a pacifist message. Violence is never okay, always off the table. It's the same kind of absolutist free speech approach that is so absurd these days. The lesson from the 18th century is that the threat of violence from the people is the only thing that keeps authority from abuse. It's in the Declaration of Independence. And if people still believe that violence has no role, there's a cemetery in Gettysburg they need to visit. But there's also one in Boston. It's called the Old Granary Burying Ground. It's right off the Common. It's just, 5 minutes from the Park Street T. Just come out and go up. The patriot resistance of the American Revolution knew that well, and some of them are in that ground. Paul Revere's there, John Hancock is there, and Samuel Adams is there. And someone wearing Samuel Adams' cloak was working some small courtyards near the State House in Boston on March 5th, 1770. The Boston Massacre not only wasn't a massacre, it wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic provocation by the patriots, manipulating a tense moment in the city. The men who died in that orchestrated political violence were part of the strategic provocation that is an important part of resistance violence. Patriots like Samuel Adams studied what had happened just a year and a half earlier, St. George's Fields in Southwark. In 1768, British troops, just south of the Thames in London, fired on protesters demanding that an opposition political figure, a guy named John Wilkes, be released from prison. The authorities freaked out, called out troops, and then the protesters started hurling rocks at the troops. And then the soldiers from the Foot Guards, I think, opened fire. 11 protesters were killed. The result was a spin campaign by the opposition, complete with visuals, that turned it into the massacre at St. George's Field. And Adams grasped something essential. Dead protesters can transform public opinion, turning it against the government. Dead colonials would turn British authority from just being irritating to them to being seen as tyrannical. As Adams said explicitly about those tactics, you can't always make events, but you can always improve them. You can make them serve your purposes. That's the ultimate end of strategic provocation. There has to be a bigger picture. It can't just be about violence. Violence on its own is just dumb. But you have to be okay with the cost, with knowing that not everyone gets to go home. As James Scott put it, speaking of resistance, no flood, no river. So what's the psychological reality when you cross that line, when you unleash the flood? Well, there are two thinkers who I read a lot who lived through fascism who understood this better than most. There's Hannah Arendt, who saw that people get confused about violence because they treat it like it has an inherent moral value. It doesn't. In this sense, violence can be a tool, like a hammer or a scalpel, like an axe. An axe is not good or evil, right? It depends whether you're a forester or if you're Lizzie Borden. Same with violence. The moral question isn't whether violence is right or wrong. It's whether a specific violence, used a specific way, achieves something that justifies the cost. But Albert Camus went deeper in The Rebel. He asked the question that haunts every resistor. How do you fight monsters without becoming one? The person who chooses violence to end oppression faces a paradox with no solution. You must violate human dignity to defend it. Camus said, you can't still and stay innocent. The question isn't whether it's justified. Sometimes it is. But you have to be crystal clear about that because the question becomes whether you can live with what it makes you. Which brings us to the stupidest version of resistance violence, assassination. When resistance movements have tried to use political assassination as a tool, let's talk about what's happened. Russia, 1881, Alexander II. A socialist resistance group was trying to overthrow the Tsars, and they adopted political assassination explicitly as a tool of doing it. They adopted this idea of propaganda by the deed, which is a form of strategic provocation. They finally got Alexander II after trying a few times, but it brought worse oppression under Alexander III. The assassination of Alexander II, and others like it, just made the establishment scared, not unstable. So they crack down and make things worse. But the most famous example that you might know of might be Franz Ferdinand, 1914. In killing him, the Black Hand thought they were striking a blow for Serbian unity. Instead, they lit this fuse on collapse. The result was World War I, which killed 1 in 4 Serbs. Think about that. Every 4th person you know, gone. Sure, in the end, after the war, they got a sort of unified Slavic state, Yugoslavia. But Serbia bled out so badly in the process that they couldn't even properly run the thing they'd killed 1/4 of their population to create. So if you're dumb about using assassination, you can get exactly what you asked for, but the price makes the prize meaningless. That whole period in the first part of the 20th century, man, saw a lot of attempts like that, which all proved a resistance rule. It doesn't work. The costs can be catastrophic, unbearable. Even success in the moment can mean losing everything that makes winning matter. Those movements were good at resisting, but terrible at resistance. What they missed in all of their passion for change was to think hard about what they were doing. They consistently mistook dramatic action for effective action. They believed in the theatrical assassination, the dramatic gesture that would wake up the masses. Later resistance movements learned from those mistakes. Wiping out a generation of your people will make that kind of impression. The only arguable exception, and let's talk about this for a second, the World War II resistance movements, who learned to target the machinery, not the symbol. They didn't go after Hitler. They went after the functionaries who actually made the system run. Let's talk for a second about Reinhard Heydrich, 1942, the architect of the final solution. Czech agents trained by the British knew killing him would bring savage reprisals, and it did. 2 whole villages erased, 5,000 murdered. And here's the unbearable part. The local Czech resistance, who knew what was going on the ground, actually begged London to call it off. They knew what was going to come. The Nazis are nothing if not predictable. But the government that was in exile in London needed to prove that Czech resistance was a real thing to the Allies so they could keep getting support. So those 5,000 people paid a price for a political calculation that they never agreed to. And the ultimate gut punch about it, which proves the existing rule, is that killing Heydrich actually accelerated the Holocaust. The Nazis named Operation Reinhard after him, the death camps that killed 1.5 million Jews. His assassination became a Nazi rallying cry to finish what he started. And that's the brutal truth about assassination. Even when you hit the right target, even when you know exactly who they are and what they do, the violence can spiral in ways you never intended. The resistance thought they were throwing sand in the gears. Instead, they gave the machine a reason to run faster. Meanwhile, the Polish Home Army was methodically killing prison guards and deportation clerks. The Danish resistance was eliminating Nazi informers left and right, 400 by the end of the war. The French were assassinating the local collaborators who could identify resistance members. No glory, no headlines, but the trains ran late, the deportation slowed, the resistance network survived. So by 1944, resistance movements across Europe had figured that out. They stopped going after the symbols and started going after the gears. Not the architect of the Holocaust, but the clerk who processes the deportation orders. Not the general, the informer who points out which house to raid. And it worked. It actually disrupted operations. It actually saved lives. But nobody remembers their names because there was nothing glorious about shooting a collaborator outside of a cafe on Vestergaard. That's what effective resistance looks like. Anonymous, methodical, and focused on function over symbolism. So let's talk about the present moment. Tough territory for a historian. We're terrible fortune tellers. We're worse about present analysis. We're focused on looking in the past. But let's talk about patterns and how they might fit to today. Part of this is why claiming the radical left killed Charlie Kirk makes no sense. That radical left doesn't exist in America. So it's what you say when you don't care about facts and you have a different agenda. So here's what history actually tells us. Symbolic assassination doesn't work, never has. The socialists who went after czars made authoritarians stronger. The Black Hand killed an archduke and got a quarter of Serbia killed. Even killing Heydrich, architect of the Holocaust, accelerated the genocide. Anyone screaming about radical left violence today is either historically illiterate or they're preparing the ground for their own crackdown, probably both, but they only care about the crackdown. Because the actual left learned this lesson a century ago. Assassination is what you do when you're not thinking clearly about beating the bastards, when you want to lose heroically, but still lose nevertheless. Because real resistance isn't about anger or desperation or moral purity. Resistance happens when you're beyond angry, when you're beyond desperate, beyond much of what passes for morality. It's about understanding how power actually works, not how it looks, but how it functions. Most people who reach for violence are just committing elaborate suicide. The ones who survive understand the machinery first. So the question isn't whether violence has a place in resistance. History has already answered that. It does. The question is whether you understand what you're actually fighting and whether you're serious about winning or just want to go down wildly swinging at pitches in the dirt. But don't let them make you the monster they need you to be. And that's exactly what they're counting on.